The name Mark Vega once carried weight in Gainesville, Florida, as the prominent senior pastor of Ignite Life Center, a congregation affiliated with the Assemblies of God. Today, however, that name is etched into headlines for all the wrong reasons. Vega stands accused of committing a felony, failing to report allegations of abuse dating back to 2019, charges that not only shake his congregation but also deepen the long-standing scrutiny already facing the Assemblies of God denomination. What emerges is not just the story of one man, but a broader examination of systemic failures, broken trust, and the heavy cost borne by victims silenced for years. As this story unfolds and we uncover the deeper truths behind it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you can stay informed on every detail. To understand the severity of these charges, one must begin with Florida law itself. In this state, as in many others, clergy are considered mandated reporters. That legal designation is not symbolic. It requires religious leaders, just like teachers, doctors, and counselors, to immediately report suspected abuse to law enforcement. The reasoning is simple. Positions of trust bring both privilege and responsibility. When Vega allegedly chose not to act, he wasn't merely exercising poor judgment. He was, according to the criminal complaint, actively breaking the law. Florida statutes recognize that silence from authority figures doesn't just fail victims, it prolongs harm and empowers abusers. For years, religious institutions have lobbied for exemptions or resisted reforms, but the law in this case was clear. Vega's alleged refusal to comply thus moves his actions into criminal territory, transforming what might otherwise have been seen as negligence into something far more deliberate and damning. Reports indicate that Vega's handling of these allegations was not passive but actively obstructionist. According to the complaint filed by Gainesville police, Vega allegedly held private meetings with families of victims, not to encourage them toward law enforcement but to keep matters quiet. Deals were reportedly floated, arrangements made to prevent damaging information from surfacing beyond church walls. Such actions, if confirmed, point to a culture of suppression designed not to protect children or congregants but to preserve the image of a ministry. Historically, this playbook is tragically familiar. From the Catholic Church's global abuse scandals to Protestant denominations facing their own reckonings, religious leaders have often sought to resolve allegations internally, prioritizing reputation over transparency. Vega's case, then, becomes a modern-day reflection of a much older, deeply damaging pattern. The belief that God's work can be preserved by silencing uncomfortable truths, when in reality that very silence becomes an accomplice to injustice. The tragedy becomes more pronounced when considering that Vega is far from the only leader within Ignite Life Center implicated in wrongdoing. Since 2023, at least 3 church leaders connected to the ministry have been arrested, including Vega's own son, Christian Vargas. For a congregation that once marketed itself as a hub of spiritual vitality and youthful energy, these repeated scandals have created the opposite impression, a community riddled with misconduct, denial, and betrayal. When misconduct spreads across multiple leaders rather than a lone figure, the problem is no longer one of individual failure but of culture and accountability. The fact that Vega's son was among those arrested raises difficult questions about nepotism, oversight, and whether familial loyalty blurred the lines between justice and cover-up. For many observers, these cascading scandals serve as proof that systemic rot has been festering for years, shielded by the charisma of leadership and the deference of followers unwilling, or unable, to challenge authority. For victims, the consequences have been devastating. Many of the allegations stem from Ignite Life's internship programs and School of Ministry, spaces specifically designed to nurture young people in faith and service. Instead, according to complaints, they became environments where abuse could take place unchecked. Some victims describe mistreatment during summer internships where teenagers and young adults were in close quarters with adults, vulnerable to manipulation and harm. Others allege that the School of Ministry, which combined youth with older participants, created conditions ripe for exploitation. The sense of betrayal is amplified by the fact that these programs were advertised as opportunities for spiritual growth, discipleship, and leadership development. When victims came forward only to see their stories dismissed or suppressed, the psychological toll deepened. To be silenced in a secular institution is crushing. To be silenced within a spiritual family is soul-wrenching. The trauma isn't just in the abuse itself but in the denial of justice and the gaslighting that often accompanies it. Perhaps the most jarring detail in the complaint is the allegation that Vega referred to an abuse case as merely a bump in the road for one offender. Those words, if proven accurate, reveal not only a gross minimization of suffering but a mindset that trivialized harm in favor of protecting perpetrators. This is not just insensitivity, it reflects a worldview in which victims' voices are secondary to the preservation of leadership. In organizational psychology, this is often described as institutional betrayal, where the very systems people trust to protect them become complicit in their pain. The phrase, bump in the road, has since become symbolic among critics of how lightly some religious leaders treat catastrophic violations of trust. It echoes a larger societal frustration, that institutions of faith, sworn to uphold morality, sometimes operate with the same dismissive cruelty as corporations protecting profits. Despite the charges, Vega has not yet been officially arrested, though the complaint now sits with the Florida Attorney General's office. Legal experts note that the delay could reflect procedural caution, the gathering of additional evidence, or strategic timing. However, the fact that charges are formally filed marks a significant turning point. It signals to victims that their stories are being taken seriously at the highest levels, and to the Church that its internal handling of matters will not shield leaders from external accountability. For years, survivors of abuse within faith institutions have argued that silence and inaction by authorities only compound the problem. The Vega case suggests a shift, one where law enforcement is increasingly willing to confront religious leaders directly, recognizing that immunity under the cloak of faith is neither legal nor moral. The Assemblies of God denomination, to which Ignite Life Center belongs, is hardly an innocent bystander in this saga. For decades, AOG churches have faced allegations of covering up abuse, mishandling complaints, and failing to hold leaders accountable. National media outlets have previously spotlighted these issues, drawing parallels to other denominations caught in cycles of secrecy and scandal. Critics argue that AOG's decentralized structure, where local churches operate with significant autonomy, creates gaps in oversight that enable misconduct to go unchecked until it becomes public scandal. Supporters counter that such autonomy empowers local congregations to tailor ministry to their communities. Yet autonomy without accountability becomes fertile ground for cover-ups. With Vega's charges now public, AOG once again finds itself under the microscope, its legacy and credibility jeopardized by what many see as systemic failures repeated across generations and congregations. For victims, there is a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that after years of silence, charges are finally being pursued, grief that it took so long, and that so many suffered in the interim. Survivors of institutional abuse often describe the pursuit of justice not as a victory but as a bittersweet acknowledgement of what was lost. Healing is complicated when justice arrives years late, when silence has already shaped lives, and when communities of faith respond with division rather than solidarity. Some victims have expressed cautious optimism, hoping that Vega's charges represent the beginning of accountability, not the end. Others remain skeptical, wary that powerful religious figures still wield influence that can shape outcomes behind closed doors. What unites them is the recognition that truth has begun to surface, even if imperfectly, and that silence has at last been broken. The broader community has reacted with anger, betrayal, and calls for accountability. Congregants, many of whom trusted Vega for years, are left grappling with the dissonance of spiritual leadership intertwined with alleged criminality. Local residents outside the church circle view the case as another example of faith institutions shielding their own at the expense of the vulnerable. Social media has amplified these conversations, with some defending Vega and others demanding his immediate arrest. The polarization is unsurprising in a culture where religious leaders are often idolized, yet it underscores the depth of disillusionment now shadowing Ignite Life Center and its wider denomination. Communities once built on trust now find themselves fractured, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the leaders they elevated and the systems they sustained. Taken together, the charges against Mark Vega illuminate lessons far larger than one pastor or one church. Leadership accountability in faith institutions is not optional. It is essential for protecting vulnerable communities. Cover-ups do not prevent scandal. They create bigger ones, amplifying harm and ensuring abuse persists unchecked. Transparency, along with mandated reporting laws, is a critical safeguard, a recognition that no institution, however sacred, can police itself without bias. Denominations that allow systemic failures to repeat risk lasting reputational damage, alienating not only their members but the broader public they seek to evangelize. Most importantly, justice for victims requires persistence, courage, and relentless public pressure. Without it, silence reigns, and silence is the ally of abuse. In the end, the story of Mark Vega and Ignite Life Center is both a cautionary tale and a call to action. It reminds us that faith, when twisted by self-preservation and denial, can become a weapon rather than a refuge. It shows how unchecked power corrodes institutions and how silence magnifies suffering. But it also reveals resilience, of victims who spoke out, of investigators who pursued the truth, of communities demanding better. Justice, delayed though it may be, has begun to stir. Whether it will be fully realized remains uncertain, but the trajectory is clear. Cover-ups are no longer guaranteed protection. For the sake of those harmed, and for the integrity of institutions that claim to represent God, accountability must prevail. The cost of silence has already been far too high. If you found this investigation meaningful, consider subscribing so you don't miss future deep dives into stories that matter.